Joining me, everybody. Charles Moscowitz. Christopher Jon Bjerknes is my guest. He's the author of many interesting books, among them Premonitions of the Holocaust, The Jewish Genocide of Armenian Christians, Einstein's Racism Exposed. Christopher, I get the sense that, your research is similar to mine in that your heart's in the right place. You're trying to understand the forces in the world that are moving us in the direction and have moved us in the direction of war, of genocide, depression, and some of the other forces that seem to be out of the control of everyday people, and that there certainly is a lot going on underneath the hood, so to speak, with that regard. And for that, I admire your work, but I really do take issue with the focus on a Jewish conspiracy.
Well, I wouldn't call it an issue. I would call it something that if you disagree, we can discuss it. And if you have points in contradiction to what I've said, I'd be glad to listen to what you say, and perhaps you can refute what I've said.
Right. Okay. Because, I'm the author of a book called Was Hitler a Leftist? And I think that you took a look at that. And I'm an author of other books as well, in that I'm very critical of, in those books, of people who have been called revolutionary Jews. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of E. Michael Jones. He wrote the book, The Revolutionary Jewish Spirit, where he talks about this with the contention that the Jews are a revolutionary movement that's in rebellion because they killed Christ. And thus we're constantly subverting the order, what he calls the logos, ever since. And that he puts the Bolshevik movement and the communist movement as a Jewish movement. And that's something that was a perception. And look, I think that, speaking here as a Jew, and I've talked about this, very controversial in Jewish circles, very controversial, in that I do believe that the Jewish people need to come to grips with the fact that a large percentage of the communist movement did involve Jews, and that it still involves Jews, and that the Jews still have a little soft spot for communism. Some do, certainly not the majority. And that this was a perception in Europe that the Jews were behind the Bolshevik Revolution, and that was a revolution that not only brought into political power the most heinous and the most bloodthirsty regime ever known to mankind historically, but there was this very strange phenomena of how the rest of the establishment world, even in the United States, they either turned a blind eye to it, or they even looked upon it and said, oh, this is great, this is progress. We had Lincoln Steffens, an American reporter, go to Moscow and come back and say, I've seen the future and it works. And whereas average people in Europe specifically, who were living under the yoke of this evil, heinous regime that had murdered 3-4 million people before Hitler even got started, they knew better. And that there's a lot of evidence to suggest that he started out as a communist. Anyway, what say you?
Well, I'm not here to defend E. Michael Jones, and I am not a religious person. I don't think he's alone in his belief in the Logos, which is the Spirit of Jesus Christ. And it's the word that was used for Spirit from the foundations of Christianity. I don't take that kind of a religious perspective on it, and I agree with you that it's not the best way to view things. But he's fully capable of defending himself, and I think his book, The Jewish Revolutionary Spirit, contains a great deal that's very well-researched, well-documented, and useful. In terms of my own views, I think that there are reasons why people assert that Jews were heavily involved in communism and the guiding force behind it, and also as a vengeful force perpetrating those millions of murders. And the murders, I think, extended beyond direct murders of executions of the bourgeoisie and the intelligentsia to the deliberate mass starvation of tens of millions of people by the time that Hitler had come to power. And the figures that were tossed around at the time were 30 million dead. So people, not only Jews, had a great consternation that they were to be blamed for these heinous crimes, but other people had a horrific consternation that this red terror would spread around the globe, as Lenin and Trotsky pledged to do.
Well, look, I mean, the Holodomor against Ukraine resulted in the starvation of millions of people. It was the most evil, the most heinous, the most systematic regime ever the world had seen up until that point, when it took power in 1918. And that there were some very prominent people involved in it who were at least Jewish in their ancestry. They had, I think, for the most part, renounced Judaism. They were at war with Judaism as much as they were at war with Christianity and freedom. They had become communists, people like Trotsky, people like the head of the Russian Cheka, who I think had Jewish background. My contention here is that, yes, these people were Jews in terms of ethnically, but they were not. They were at war with. They were part of this subversion of Judaism that started, I would point to, with a false messiah in the 17th century named Zvi, and that this subverted Judaism. They were enemies of Judaism, even though they were Jews ethnically, and that they started this ball rolling with this secretive, shape-shifting societies, and they glommed into the establishment. And I've covered this. I think that it's Christianity would then be subverted by the Illuminati, which was a Catholic movement mostly, and which led to the French Revolution, which was against the Catholic power in France. And that you have versions of this metastasizing across the globe. And look, I think that you and I are on the same page in our attempt to try to understand it and expose it. But I think that where I differ with you is that there is nothing inherently Jewish about this. They're enemies of God. They're enemies of the Torah and all the moral and ethical precepts that embody the Torah. And that's the essence of Judaism. And that's the covenant of Judaism, the Mosaic covenant. These people are enemies.
Well, even in the French Revolution, you had a prominent figure who had changed his name. His real name was Moses Trebrushka, and he was a cousin of the people that you were speaking of, Jacob Frank, who believed that he had inherited the soul of Shabbatai Tzvi.
Yes.
And he changed his name to Schoenfeld, and he was one of the prominent figures in the French Revolution. So again, there is a significant...
You're right, and that's the one Jew that I can find that's connected to that. But the point is, it was largely inspired by the Jacobin clubs, who I think, according to Abbe Baruel, who was the author of The Origins of Jacobinism, and also Proofs of a Conspiracy by Professor Robeson in Scotland, that these secretive societies inside of Paris had a direct connection with the Illuminati, and that even President George Washington acknowledged this in a letter that he wrote to someone that's in display at the Library of Congress, where he points out that there was concern that his lodge might have been infiltrated by the Illuminati, and he felt that it was not. But nevertheless, there was an awareness of this diabolical plan, and that Weishaupt did try to, and this is standard history in Europe. I mean, this isn't even, I know when I talk about it here, people think I'm a nut, and I haven't got a
No, everything you've just said, I agree with completely, and I have found to be factually correct based on my research. I wouldn't take exception to any of that.
Well, then what's the deal with...
But I would like to respond to the other question in terms of the differentiations that you're making between Shabbatean Jews who worship Saturn and Judaism in general. There is certainly that schism. But it's like saying, if you're a Republican, that Democrats don't have the right to call themselves Americans. And if you're a Democrat, you're saying that Republicans don't have the right to call themselves Americans. So it becomes a semantical issue, which really isn't very interesting. The fact is that the Shabbataians were crypto-Jews and are crypto-Jews, and their God... The reason why they turn against their God is not because they disbelieve in the same God that you believe in, but that they want to provoke that God into action through committing sins against that God. And they want to inspire that God to attack the Jewish people and create new order in the world by destroying all governments, by causing an ingathering of Jewish people in Palestine, rebuilding the temple, and asserting their power over the entire earth. And I think it is a disservice to the truth to deny that is related to Judaism. It is related to the Old Testament. It is related to the Torah, which itself calls for the genocide of all the peoples living in Palestine, for a world government, for the use of usury to gain world hegemony.
Well, first of all,
found in the Torah itself, which you find to be a glorious document, but I do not.
Yes, I do. Now, Christopher, first of all, I don't deny the fact that these people are Jewish. I didn't say that. They're bad Jews, but they're Jews. I mean, and it's a problem.
Well, you said that they have renounced Judaism, and I take exception to that. I think they have deliberately tried to do the opposite of Judaism for the specific purpose of fulfilling Judaism, which is a very significant distinction.
Okay, thank you. No, they've denounced the faith. I would argue, and this is where we differ, they have denounced Jewish faith. They've denounced Jewish religion. They're still Jews, but they're very bad.
That's not true. They are staunch Kabbalists, and they have denounced the Talmud, just as Jesus Christ denounced the scribes and Pharisees, and they find a strong affiliation with Christianity, which in some senses is the origins of Kabbalah. But there are no Orthodox Jews who would say that Kabbalah is not Judaism.
Well, Kabbalah is a way to study the Torah, and it's been misused by people who are not qualified to study it and who have misinterpreted it to mean different things.
But again, you're speaking as a factionary. You are of one faction, and they would just say the same about you in reverse.
No, I think that's understood in Judaism, that to study Kabbalah, you have to have a certain level of qualification, a certain sophistication.
You have to have a belly full of Talmud, according to Orthodox Judaism.
And also, you have to be a person of high character who is both in the world and also spiritually at a certain level, and you have to be.
But the definitions of high character are not the standard definitions that Western civilization utilizes. The Kabbalah teaches that only Jews are men, and that Jewish souls differ from Gentile souls.
No, I reject that.
That is not considered high character in the other Abrahamic faiths.
I reject that. And also, as far as the Torah goes,
well, I can quote you the passages, and I can quote you the interpretations of the passages by prominent Jews.
I also want to respond to your comments about the Torah. The Torah specifically calls for the annihilation of very specific groups of people who existed 6,000 years ago and who were, for whatever reason...
6,000 or...
Well, maybe, 5,000 to 6,000 years? Excuse me?
They still exist.
No, they don't exist. The point is that these are people that God commanded the children of Israel at Sinai, that when they entered Canaan, they would have to
If they don't exist, then why did we have Rabbi Kahana calling for their extermination in the present day?
I never heard Kahana call for anybody to be exterminated. I called for people to be evicted, but putting that aside.
Why is he utilizing, don't change the subject. Why is he utilizing the Torah as a basis and foundation for that to be a holy mission of the Jewish people if those people don't exist?
Well, first of all, Kahana was kicked out of Israel. I mean, doesn't represent.
You're not answering my question.
What did he say? That he called for someone to be annihilated? No, I don't think he did. But
he
putting that aside,
utilized the Torah and referred to Joshua chapter 23 to say that these people are thorns in our eyes and our sides, and that they need to be expelled. So he was identifying those people as the same people who are identified in the Torah as being the people who will be thorns in your eyes and in your sides if you don't annihilate them.
Well, that's why Kahana was rejected and kicked out of Israel. That's not mainstream Judaism. That's that's heresy. I mean, no one is saying.
This is pointless, because when I point out the Jews who are doing this and establish factually that these are Jewish people doing this, you simply disown them. That's
disowning them. Look, Adolf Hitler was a Catholic. Does that mean that Catholics call for the Holocaust? I mean, look, the point is that in the Torah,
but we're not talking about isolated individuals with ulterior motives. We're talking about formal Jewish scholarship by the head rabbis of Judaism for thousands of years.
No, this is not formal scholarship. This was Kahana, and that he was an outlier at best. Now, and I'm not saying he wasn't.
It's not just Kahana. It was Rabbi Joseph Ovidia, who was the chief Sephardic rabbi of Israel.
Who called for the annihilation of people? I don't think so.
No, he called for the enslavement of people. He said that if non-Jews want to live in Jews, then they have to do so as slaves.
I'd have to see that. But the point is that the Torah, getting back to
why isn't that shocking to you?
It is shocking.
This is strange to me.
I am very disturbed if that's true. The point is that...
Well, it's also true that 1 million people attended the man's funeral.
Right, and I'll have to see what you're talking about. So
this is mainstream Judaism. This is not some...
I understand that. I'd have to see that he's called for somebody to be enslaved. I need to see that. The point is that 4,000, 5,000 years ago, when Moses received the commands from God to annihilate very select people at a very specific time in history, because I don't really know why. I'm not a Torah expert. I believe it's because they were so evil, I guess, that God commanded that the children of Israel do this. They didn't want to do it. They didn't even accomplish it. But it applies to a time in history that is no longer
If they did not accomplish it, what happened to those people?
They were either killed or they were driven out of Canaan, is what happened to them. According to rabbinic legend, these were people who were giants, or they were people who had mated with I don't know, it's like this whole bizarre thing around it. But the point is that
this is getting ridiculous. They were not giants.
They did not apply. Whatever it was,
whatever it was. You don't give a damn. You're a phony.
No, I do care what they were 6,000 years ago.
This is just silly.
They do not apply to anybody today. Hello?